Thanks, everyone. Great to see so many faces here and to be back in person for the first time in far too long. I just want to start by acknowledging that geoscience is taking place in the traditional territory of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Tanquatching Council, so thank you very much for having us here. Today I'm going to talk about a bit of a big vision here, but I think it really builds off what we've been hearing in earlier talks, both yesterday and today, and that's the energy situation in Yukon, and specifically looking at connecting Yukon to the BC power grid. So those of you who might know, the power grid in Yukon is fully isolated from the rest of the country. Using some numbers here from a study back in 2018, the total generating capacity in Yukon at that point was about 140 megawatts. 93 megawatts of that came from renewable sources, hydro and wind, primarily hydro. But in addition to that, there is significant diesel and LNG generation. And a large chunk of that diesel generation does happen in communities that are currently not on the grid. The grid itself is actually really quite renewable in Yukon. However, we're now talking about a future with climate change and trying to do a lot of work to reduce emissions and to move forward in a green economy. And to achieve those successes, we're going to need a lot more power. So there's insufficient capacity on the grid as it is to meet those targets, but there's also no capacity in the grid for new major industrial customers, such as mines. Looking at an annualized kind of usage of power in Yukon, 2020 numbers, there was about 70 gigawatt hours of non-renewable energy consumed in the Yukon. Currently, there are rental diesel generators present, both, I believe, at the dam in Whitehorse as well as in Faro, and that's simply just keeping the grid running. So we're in a situation right now where there's already a shortage. We already have to bring in rental diesel just to keep the lights on, so to speak. Hydro generation also has some struggles sometimes. It's a bit of a seasonal mismatch. Higher power demand here is in the Yukon when there's heating loads, but hydro actually produces the most power in the summer. So the Yukon Energy has looked at a lot of solutions around that with pumped storage and other systems, but fundamentally there are kind of some offset challenges with hydro energy. Also in the future could be susceptible to droughts and other conditions. So it's a great source of power, but it might not solve all the solutions. Speaking of the renewable energy plan, this was put out by Yukon Energy in 2020. It's their 10-year renewable energy plan, kind of looking at what they see as the next steps. And I apologize, Andrew Hall, I'm going to be a bit critical of it here, but that's just my perspective. It's about a $700 million expenditures in small-scale renewable projects. The funding, my understanding, is it's not fully secured at the time. And I'm sure people have seen recently in the news, the Atlan expansion project is already $200 million over budget. So it's a number of projects that are looking at kind of meeting some of this demand, but there's already challenges in execution there. And if you really look at it, I mean, there's some other challenges that I see kind of with this plan, and I know they put a lot of work into it, and it really is the best option that they've been able to come forward with, and I think it is the best option available inside Yukon, but ultimately, it doesn't reduce the existing baseload thermal generation requirements. You can see, if you look at the graph there, there is still significant amounts of thermal generation present, even in 2035, when that full build-out has happened. It does offset the current rental generation, but isn't going to help us meet those targets that we're trying to meet. Additionally, the peak demand forecast that's used here does not include mines. And I believe my understanding is that in situations where you hit maximum peak load, they might actually need mines to turn down power requirements to be able to meet those peaking, and that's obviously not ideal in an industrial situation. So if we're looking forward, we're looking at new mines being built, we need to bring a significant amount more power online to the territory. So how do we do that? Well, in 2015, the Yukon government did a study with Midgard Consulting looking at this potential for a BC grid interconnect. Now, this was done in the context of building, there was the next generation hydro project. They were looking at building new dams in Yukon, connecting to BC and selling the power down there. Well, that didn't end up actually making a lot of business sense in the end. And the next generation hydro project had difficulty identifying a place you could actually build a new dam in Yukon with environmental concerns and other sensitivities. But what it did do is it looked at where this line might go and what it might cost. And it's about a 763-kilometer connection that runs from Whitehorse down to the east through Watson Lake and connects up with the Highway 37 grid extension that was done in BC. Now, the costing on that back in 2015 was $1.7 billion. So, hefty chunk of change. We all know things have cost more since then, so we're probably looking at about $2 billion right now. A lot of money, but if you really think about it, the benefits that it can bring to both Yukon and the Canada's economy as a whole is significant. It also ties in really well with the current policy frameworks that we see from the federal government. We've got multiple climate change strategies, healthy economy strategies. We're talking about critical minerals. We're talking about the green economy of the future. And if you dive into the recent federal budgets, in the 2021 federal budget, they allocated $40 million over the next 3 years to support feasibility and planning of hydroelectricity and grid interconnection projects. They followed that up in the budget 2022, which is, I think, still being voted on, with $250 million over the next 4 years to support things that include interprovincial electricity transmission projects. So there is money that's already been set aside by the federal government for projects such as these. Obviously, it's not enough to actually build it, but it is enough to get started. And as I mentioned, critical minerals, and we've all been talking about critical minerals for the last couple of days here. It's a huge push that we're hearing from the federal government, the territorial government, from countries across the world. And the Yukon is well positioned with a lot of access to critical minerals, but we're missing the infrastructure piece. The fun thing here is there's a lot of money for that as well. There's $4 billion allocated to critical minerals in the 2022 budget, including $1.5 billion for infrastructure development. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank also has $5 billion set aside for clean power investment. So there is money for these sort of projects. And then the other benefit it's going to bring is to mining in the economy. And obviously, it's a mining conference. That's what I'm here to talk about. But I see it really as leveraging. We can use mines to help leverage and make this project happen, which will then have bigger economic and positive socioeconomic ramifications for the whole territory. We heard earlier, the CO2 production per ton of metals is a huge consideration. Modern mining investment, it's critical that you have access to a low carbon source of energy. And we're just not going to see investment in mines anymore unless you can connect to a grid that has low carbon power. We have tons of fantastic projects, both in northern BC and in Yukon, that are in the critical metals space. And I've just pulled a few examples of some of them up here. You can see there's significant power requirements for all of those if they were to be built. And we're talking over 450 megawatts worth of power. Most of them are currently planning to use LNG or diesel simply because they're not near a grid. If this grid interconnect was to be built, you could probably put all of these proposed projects on the grid. I won't dive into this too much because Keith Halliday covered it really quite well yesterday, but mining contributes directly about 14% of Yukon's GDP, $407 million last year based on Statistics Canada's analysis. That was significant growth from 2020. It was a 34.4% year-over-year growth. So we're seeing increased development in the economy from mining, and that can largely be attributed to the fact that Victoria Gold's online now. We're seeing active mining in Yukon to a scale we haven't seen for a long time. But what it doesn't capture is that service and supply sector contribution that comes outside of the overall mining bucket. Construction, professional services, transportation, there's all these kind of knock-on benefits that mines bring to the Yukon economy. And if you look at some of these proposed mines in detail and look at the economic benefits that they expect to bring to the territory directly, for example, a Casino 2013 study, I'm sure they're working on updated data here, but that's what I could find. It was a $274 million annual GDP contribution to Yukon. That is significant. And that can really quickly start to pay for significant pieces of infrastructure. Kudzikaya, it's $500 million US per year annual GDP contribution to Canada. So if a power grid helps get any of these projects online really, really quickly, you pay back that significant infrastructure investment. And you help bring all those jobs forward that you see at the bottom. Talking about the green economy, this is on everyone's mind right now. We're moving into a green, clean future that's going to be based on critical metals and clean energy. And we hear a lot about Canada being a great place to build new mines for critical metals, and I think personally it is the best place that we can be exploring and trying to develop mining projects. We can ensure that things that are built here are done to high environmental and social standards. We can largely use non-fossil fuel sourced electricity. Looking last year at Canada's grid nationally, 10% was fossil fuels. The rest is already renewable resources. And also, we need these metals in country. If we produce them here, it's less transportation rather than shipping them all the way across the sea. So it just makes sense to mine locally, to do it right, to do it ourselves, and we know we're going to need these metals. Looking at Yukon's forecast, there's the Our Clean Future. It talks about a 45% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production by 2035. That is a challenging number if you think about it. We're not building mines inefficiently so that we can just cut 45% of the emissions later. We're building mines as efficiently as possible. That's what we want to do. But where do you get these savings? And if you look at it, and there's some charts there that probably don't really come through clearly, but what it says, in effect, is the major places where you use fuel and energy in mining. There's the extraction piece, like actually pulling the metal out of the ground. There's a transportation piece, getting it back to your plant. but then there's beneficiation, like grinding, processing the power. And I mean, you can do things to electrify those, but you can't actually reduce the overall amount of energy needed. So the only way to actually reduce emissions there is to be able to use clean power to power these sources of energy. And there's a lot of work being done now on electrification of fleets, et cetera, but if you can't connect to a clean power grid, it doesn't really matter. So fundamentally, if we're going to meet these emissions targets, I think the only thing we can do is connect to the BC grid to have that access to low carbon power. So what else? What other benefits is it going to bring? Well, it'll provide stable, reliable, clean power to 6 off-grid communities, take them off the existing diesel generation that they're on it. It can bring direct benefits to Tahltan, the Cascadene, Teslin Tlingit First Nations, whose territories the line would run through, and many other communities and First Nations along the way. It would reduce Yukon's dependence on diesel and LNG for power generation, and it would support these critical goals within our Clean Future strategy that Yukon government has put forward. If you look at the pie chart there, you can see the profile of Yukon's greenhouse gas emissions in 2017. Mining is about 10%, and a lot of other components are very small. The biggest components of those emissions are heating and road transportation. And if you think about that, well, how are we going to reduce those sectors? We can electrify people's heating. We can put heat pumps in. A lot of that's happening now. Great. Road transportation, maybe electric trucks, maybe electric railroad. Think outside the box. There's ways to do that. But if you then just hook those up to a grid that's powered by a diesel generator, you're really not solving the problem. So if we're going to electrify these things and really reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, we need access to a heck of a lot of power, and it needs to be clean power. So why now? Well, I think I've kind of run through a lot of that already. The Yukon grid is already beyond capacity. The next generation hydro project failed to identify anywhere that you could build significant hydro development in Yukon, and that was an exhaustive study. There's multiple development stage mining projects in northern BC and Yukon that could immediately benefit from this. Some of them may not even proceed until this grid connection is available. Because major mining companies right now are emphasizing it's critical to have access to low carbon grid power to actually move forward with the project. There's also an interesting situation in BC right now where they're building the Site C dam, and I'm sure people have heard about a little bit of the controversy around that, and the BC government's proceeding with it regardless. But it was originally supposed to be powering all of these LNG export terminals that aren't happening anymore. So there's a potential there for some excess power to be available in BC. If we can find a home for it up here, helping to modernize and make a green economy here, it's really just a win for everyone. So I believe it's the only way that we can actually meet Yukon's emissions targets and get the territory to the place we want it to be. And right now, we're in a very fortunate situation where it aligns with all of these federal government strategies and aligns with funding priorities that are already established in the federal budget. So how do we move it forward? Well, first step is to secure support from the territorial and federal government and have conversations with the BC government. And my understanding is, Yukon government has in the past studied this, and there may be work ongoing now, but let's continue to work with them. Let's get formal commitments of support. This is not to build it, but support to study it, to advance the project, to keep thinking about it. Once that's done, there's a lot of technical work to be done. There needs to be a route selection and alternatives assessment. Maybe the line's better going through Southeast Alaska and connecting to the States. Maybe it's better off going up through Faro instead. This sort of work just needs to be done on the technical piece. We need to develop a business case, look at the actual economic benefits and impacts that we expect to get from building the line, see if it all balances out. And then First Nations consultation and engagement is a huge piece here. And we know how that's a significant amount of time that takes to do it properly. So getting started on that process sooner rather than later will allow this to actually move forward. And it goes on from there, all the way through environmental baseline work. So that's stuff we can get going in the short term while the funding is being identified and the project's actually being advanced. So I think the best way to move this forward, if you look at the Northwest Transmission Line project in BC, the Highway 37 extension for the Red Chris mine, that was an industry coalition that partnered with First Nations and government. So I would love to advance this project by partnering with the territorial, federal governments, with the local First Nations, and just build a coalition to support this and to drive it forward. So that's my thesis on connecting the grid. And I don't know what my timing's like, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.